If stories about hidden corners of the world are your kind of thing, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep bringing these overlooked places and untold stories to more people. Drive 3 hours south from the border of the United Arab Emirates, and something strange happens. The glass towers disappear, the 12-lane highways narrow and quiet down. The roar of construction and traffic fades until the only sound left is the Indian Ocean hitting dark volcanic rock. You have crossed a border, but it feels less like entering a different country and more like stepping into a different century. The pressure of the modern Gulf simply stops. The air and pace changes, everything gets quieter in a way that takes a few minutes to understand and longer to explain. This is Muscat, the capital of Oman. And the first thing you notice is not what is here, it is what is not. There are no skyscrapers. By royal decree, no building in this city can rise above 8 stories. That is roughly the height of a mature coastal palm tree, and the comparison is not accidental. There are no neon signs burning through the desert night, no artificial islands pushed into the sea, no gold-plated hotels fighting for your attention. Every building follows a strict municipal law. White or beige, traditional arched windows. Nothing that announces itself. The city sits low and flat against its volcanic mountains like it has always been there and has never felt the need to prove anything. To eyes trained on the Gulf, this looks like a country left behind. It is the opposite. Oman looked at what its neighbours were building and made a calculated, fully conscious choice to build something else entirely. While every state around it was pouring oil money into vertical monuments and global publicity campaigns, Oman chose restraint. While the region was racing to put itself on the map through sheer architectural ambition, Oman chose to stay off the map. It kept its mountain valleys quiet, its ancient forts standing, and its fishing villages unhurried. It built a country that looked and felt like Arabia still had a soul, and it did this while fully aware of the alternative sitting just 3 hours north up the highway. That choice runs deeper than building codes and paint colours. Because the same country that refused to build a skyline also became, quietly and without a single press announcement, the most important secret diplomat in the Middle East. The back channel that world powers use when every other door has been closed and bolted. The room where enemies have sat down and found a way to stop being enemies. Oman has brokered peace between nations that refuse to acknowledge each other publicly. It has hosted secret negotiations that change the course of history. It has done all of this in complete silence, taking no credit, holding no press conferences, and asking for nothing in return. World leaders from Washington to Tehran to Tel Aviv have used Muscat as their quiet meeting point for 50 years. Almost none of them have said so publicly. How does a small, modest country become the world's most trusted back channel? And why does it work so hard to make sure nobody knows? The answer does not start with diplomacy. It does not start with oil. It starts with what this country was before any of that existed. And the person who can take you there is an elder who grew up in a village with no school, no hospital, no road, and no electricity. A man who watched his country go from absolute darkness to something the world is only beginning to understand. He sits on a woven floor mat in a quiet room in Muscat, his hands resting on a traditional silver dagger, and he remembers. When I was a boy, there were no schools in my village. No hospitals, no paved roads, no electricity. That was 1965, less than 60 years ago. Sometimes I look at Muscat now and I think I must have dreamed the before part. He did not dream it, and understanding that world is the only way to understand this one. The building codes in Muscat are so strict that even the specific shade of white paint used on residential villas must be pre-approved by the municipal government. The goal is not uniformity for its own sake. It is the protection of a visual landscape that took centuries to form and could be destroyed in a decade. The Hermit Kingdom. Oman before 1970. In 1970, Oman had just about 10 kilometres of paved road. Not 10 kilometres per city or region, 10 kilometres in the entire country. A nation roughly the size of Germany, with mountains and coastline and desert stretching in every direction, connected by 10 kilometres of asphalt and everything else left to dirt, rock and whatever knowledge the person walking ahead of you had managed to pass on. There were 3 schools, 2 hospitals, both funded and run by American Christian missionaries on the coast. No radio, no television, no newspapers. The gates of the capital city were locked every single night at dusk. If you wanted to walk through the streets of Muscat after sunset, you carried a lit kerosene lantern at shoulder height. If the flame went out, the palace guards patrolling the alleys would arrest you on the spot. There was no flexibility on this. The rule was the rule. This was not the 14th century. This was 1970, the same year the Beatles released their final album. The same year the first Boeing 747 entered commercial service. It was the same year the world watched Apollo 13 limp back from space. And a man was sitting behind locked gates in the dark with 10 kilometers of road and 2 missionary hospitals connecting everything. How does a country end up this isolated in 1970? Not through poverty alone, not through geography alone, through one man. A ruler who believed with complete conviction that the modern world was a threat to his people, and that the only answer was to keep it out entirely. Sultan Said bin Taimur ruled Oman from 1932 to 1970. He was not a conventionally violent tyrant. He did not run a secret police force or a killing machine of the kind that neighbouring regimes maintained. He was something in some ways more suffocating than that. He was a deeply conservative, absolute monarch who genuinely believed that keeping his country frozen was the only way to keep it safe. Modern ideas, in his view, would corrupt his people's faith and unravel the tribal balance he had inherited. The outside world was a threat, and his response was to close the door and bolt it from the inside. We lived in total darkness, the elder says, his voice low, his eyes moving slowly toward the window, as if the memory is somewhere out there in the street. If you wanted to walk through Muscat after sunset, you needed a lantern. If your light went out, the guards would take you in. We had no electricity in our homes, no roads connecting our villages, and no idea what was happening in the world outside our borders. We didn't know what we were missing. That was the point. The rules went far beyond the lantern. Wearing trousers was illegal. Wearing sunglasses on the street was illegal. Buying a bicycle required a written permit bearing the personal signature of the Sultan himself. Importing a radio required the same permission because radios were considered dangerous vehicles for foreign political ideas. Travelling between different tribal regions of your own country meant passing through heavily fortified mountain checkpoints where you had to justify your journey and pay internal customs taxes. Foreigners were almost entirely kept out. Omanis who managed to get educated abroad sometimes found themselves unable to come home. The oil had already been discovered by this point. Commercial extraction began in 1967. The money was flowing into state accounts, and the Sultan was leaving it there, convinced that spending it would trigger the very change he had spent his entire reign trying to prevent. While Kuwait was building universities, Bahrain was developing a modern financial sector, and the nascent UAE was laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most extraordinary urban experiments in human history. Oman was doing nothing. Deliberately, systematically, and by direct instruction from the top, nothing. The gap between Oman and its neighbours was not growing because of bad luck or a shortage of resources. It was growing because the man at the top had decided the gap was preferable to the alternative. For the people living inside this, the consequences were immediate and physical. If a child fell sick in the mountain interior, the family faced a journey of several days across brutal rocky terrain to reach one of the 2 missionary clinics on the coast. Many died before they arrived. Traditional medicine was the only accessible option for most, which often meant pressing hot iron rods against the skin to drive out infections. If you wanted your child to learn to read, you found a religious teacher in the village mosque who would work through the Quran line by line under the shade of a tree. That was the entirety of the available education for most Omanis. My father was an incredibly sharp and deeply observant man, the elder says, setting his small coffee cup down carefully. He could read the behaviour of ocean waves and desert wind better than most educated men I have met since. But because there was no school for him to attend, he lived his entire life and died without ever learning how to write his own name. That is what the old Sultan's rules meant in practice. Not just isolation, theft. The word lands quietly in the room. The elder does not elaborate on it, and he doesn't need to. The silence after it says everything. By the late 1960s, the pressure building inside the country had found its first violent expression. In the southern province of Dhofar, a communist insurgency had taken root in the mountains. Backed by South Yemen and supplied with modern weapons by the Soviet Union, the Dhofar rebellion was gaining ground through the valleys. The Sultan's methods, built entirely on isolation and tribal suppression, had no answer for a guerrilla movement with modern weapons and an ideology that spoke directly to the grievances of people who had been denied almost everything. The rebellion was spreading. The military was overstretched. The country's tiny infrastructure was crumbling. The oil money was sitting untouched in accounts while the South burned. Something had to give, and in July 1970 it finally did. What gave was not a popular uprising or a foreign invasion or a slow negotiated transition. What gave was a door in a palace in Salalah that opened with a small amount of force and a very large amount of consequence. On the other side of it stood a 29-year-old man who had spent years in effective house arrest in that same palace, reading, thinking, and waiting for exactly this moment. He was the Sultan's son. And in the space of about 20 minutes, he changed everything. In 1969, it was strictly illegal to use any form of foreign currency inside Oman. The only officially accepted money was the Maria Theresa thaler, an 18th century silver coin originally minted in Austria. This was not a quirk of tradition. It was a deliberate policy of economic isolation, keeping Oman disconnected from the global financial system at a time when the rest of the Gulf was rapidly integrating into it. The Renaissance Qaboos bin Said had been sent to England at 15, educated at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and served briefly with the British Army in Germany. After then, he was called home by his father and kept in Salalah under what amounted to permanent house arrest. He was allowed to read and study Islam, local governance, and history. He was not allowed to travel, govern, meet foreign officials, or to prepare in any official capacity for the role that everyone, including his father, knew was coming. So most governments that come into sudden oil wealth build from the top down. They pour capital into grand monuments, glittering capital cities, and impressive military hardware because these things are visible, photographable, and politically useful in the short term. Qaboos went in the opposite direction. He looked at his country and understood that a nation cannot move forward if the people at the bottom of it are still living in conditions from 5 centuries ago. So he started there. Within the first year, schools began opening across the country, not just in Muscat, but in mountain villages, coastal towns, and places that had never had a paved road leading to them, let alone a classroom, because there were not enough buildings to handle the sudden wave of eager students. Classes were held in tents, under trees, and in any structure that could keep the sun off a teacher and 30 children for a few hours. The education was free, it was mandatory, and for the first time in the country's history, the classroom doors were opened to girls. I remember the exact morning the first makeshift school opened in our district, the elder says, his eyes warming as he watches a group of students walk past the courtyard outside. My father was deeply frightened at first because the old ways taught us that a woman's place was in the home. But the new sultan was unyielding on this point. He told the tribal elders directly that you cannot build a successful nation if you keep half your population in ignorance. My father watched my younger sister walk to school every morning with her books. Within a few weeks, his fear dissolved completely. And what was left on his face was just pride. My granddaughter is a practicing doctor in Muscat today. My father could not have imagined that in his lifetime. I watched it happen, and I still find it difficult to believe. The speed of the physical transformation was extraordinary. But what made Qaboos genuinely different from the rulers transforming other Gulf states at exactly the same time was not how fast he built. It was what he refused to destroy in the process. While historic neighbourhoods across the Gulf were being bulldozed to make room for concrete suburbs and generic shopping centres, Qaboos issued a series of royal decrees that did something almost unheard of in the region. He protected the past. Ancient mountain fortresses, some of them crumbling badly, were meticulously restored using traditional materials by traditional craftsmen. New state highways were designed to curve around historic foliage irrigation channels rather than cutting through them. Trees that had stood for centuries were left standing, with roads built around them rather than over them. Every new building had to look like it belonged in Oman, not in London or Houston, not in whatever architectural style was fashionable somewhere else that year. Here, the result was a country that modernised without losing its face, and that distinction would define everything that came after. By the mid-1970s, the Dhofar rebellion had been brought to a permanent end, not through military force alone, but through the same logic Qaboos applied to everything. Build something genuinely worth belonging to, and people will stop trying to destroy it. Free schools, modern clinics, and paved roads went into the southern mountains alongside the security forces. The insurgency lost the developmental grievances that had sustained it. Oman had survived its first great test and stepped out of the dark without losing its shape. What Qaboos had demonstrated was not just that Oman could develop fast. He had demonstrated that a country could choose what kind of development it wanted, and hold to that choice even under enormous commercial pressure to abandon it. That discipline, established in the first years of his reign, became the thread running through everything Oman built afterward. The architecture, foreign policy, and the culture. All of it flows from the same decision made in 1970 by a 29-year-old man who had spent 6 years in a palace with nothing to do but think about what he would do differently. The question now was what kind of country all of that discipline would produce. And the answer Qaboos gave to that question is the one that makes Oman unlike anywhere else in the Gulf. The rapid educational expansion initiated by Sultan Qaboos produced one of the fastest literacy gains ever recorded anywhere in the world. Oman went from a 5% literacy rate in 1970 to over 95% by 2020. That transformation happened within a single lifetime. The man who started it ruled for exactly 50 years. The anti-Dubai architecture, culture, and the deliberate rejection of excess. By the late 1990s, something extraordinary was happening a few hundred kilometres north of Muscat. Dubai was rewriting the rules of what a city could be. Artificial islands blasted into the Persian Gulf. An indoor ski slope built inside a shopping mall in the middle of a desert that regularly hit 45 degrees. The tallest building in human history, rising from what had been empty sand a decade earlier. The world watched with a mixture of disbelief and genuine fascination. Investors arrived. Airlines added routes. Magazines ran cover stories. Dubai became the defining image of what Arab ambition looked like in the 21st century, and every government in the region felt the pressure to respond. Oman watched all of this, studied it carefully, and then did something that surprised everyone who was paying attention. It passed a law banning skyscrapers entirely. Not reluctantly, or as a temporary measure while it figured out its own version of the Dubai model, as a permanent, deliberate, unapologetic policy. No building in Muscat could exceed 8 stories. There were no glass curtain walls and neon signage on the main highways. Every new structure had to incorporate traditional Omani design elements, arches, domes, and stepped battlements drawn from the heritage of the country's ancient desert forts. Even the approved paint colours were specified by law: white, cream, light beige, nothing that announced itself loudly. The question every outsider asked was the same. Why would a wealthy country with oil money and regional ambition choose to look deliberately modest when the blueprint for looking impressive was sitting right there, just up the road? The answer says everything about how Oman thinks about itself and what it believes it is actually for. People from the outside thought we had completely lost our minds, the elder says, setting down his coffee with a quiet smile. They pointed at the cranes over Dubai and told us we were making a foolish choice. But our leadership understood something fundamental. A glass tower in the desert looks exactly like a tower in New York or Shanghai. Anyone with enough money can hire architects and import steel. But a city that grows from its own soil, that reflects its own history in every wall and arch, cannot be copied by anyone. You cannot import our past. You cannot franchise our identity. It is either real or it is nothing. The building codes were enforced with the seriousness of national security policy. Government ministries, private villas, office complexes, luxury hotels, petrol stations, and fast food outlets were all required to adapt their designs to match the architectural character of their surroundings. International brands that wanted to operate in Oman had to modify their standard templates to comply with the local aesthetic. No exceptions were made for corporate size or global reputation. The result, visible from any street in Muscat, is a capital city that genuinely looks like it belongs in the landscape it occupies. Low, white, proportioned to human scale. The volcanic mountains behind the city are visible from almost every street corner because nothing has been built tall enough to block them. Walk through the Mutra Souk, And you feel this philosophy in its oldest and most immediate form. The souk is not a heritage attraction designed for tourists to photograph between hotel visits. It is a functioning market where Omani men in crisp white dish dashers and beautifully embroidered kumas buy frankincense, dried limes, silver jewellery and fragrant spices. They buy it in the same narrow lanes their grandfathers explored centuries before them. The dark wooden roof filters the afternoon sun into sharp shafts of light that fall across massive sacks of coloured spices, handmade copper pots, and coils of marine rope. The smell inside is specific and ancient. Frankincense smoke, dried fish, rosewater, and the particular dusty warmth of timber that has been absorbing heat for generations. Nobody is performing for your camera here. This is simply how it is, and how it has been for a very long time. The cultural code that governs life inside these spaces is as carefully maintained as the architecture outside them, and it has nothing to do with government tourism campaigns. Omani hospitality is not a product. It is a moral obligation with roots deep enough that violating it carries genuine social shame. When you enter an Omani home, a traditional shop, or even a modest office in a mountain village, you're not received as a customer or a transaction. You are received as a guest. Coffee appears immediately, brewed pale and aromatic with green cardamom and fragrant saffron, poured into small handleless cups. Fresh dates follow. Cold water. The offering is made before any business is discussed. It is made before any purpose for your visit is established, and sometimes before your name is even asked. The sequence is not random. It is deliberate. It says, you are here first as a human being. Everything else comes second. Refusing this offering is not a neutral social act. It registers as a direct rejection of the person extending it. It signals that you do not consider yourself their guest, which in Omani culture means you do not wish to be under their protection or show them basic respect. Most foreign visitors do not understand how much that small, careless refusal actually costs them in terms of trust. This code was not invented to impress modern travellers. It developed over centuries in a harsh desert environment where a stranger arriving at your door was genuinely vulnerable. And your response to that vulnerability defined your character permanently. The culture preserved this code long after the practical necessity of desert survival faded, because it understood correctly that the way a society treats a stranger is a more accurate measure of its values than the height of its buildings. In our marketplaces, you cannot tell who is wealthy and who is not, the elder says, gesturing toward the street outside. Everyone wears the same dish dasher, the same kuma. We do not walk around announcing our bank accounts with foreign luxury brands or gold watches. To do so is considered deeply poor manners here. Your worth is measured by how you speak to people, how you receive a guest and conduct yourself when nobody important is watching. That is the Omani standard. It has not changed. The wealth contrast between Oman and its neighbours is not a contrast of resources, it is a contrast of values. Oman has significant oil revenues, its people are comfortable. There are good hotels, good restaurants and modern shopping centres, but the luxury is quiet. It is expressed through craftsmanship, quality of materials, and the care taken with natural environments rather than through scale, spectacle, or the accumulation of superlatives. A visitor who arrives expecting the Gulf they know from Dubai or Abu Dhabi will find something that takes a day or two to calibrate to. The reward for that calibration is considerable. What Oman built by choosing restraint over spectacle was something that money, paradoxically, cannot easily buy back once it has been sold. A genuine sense of place. A city and a culture that feel like themselves rather than like an aspirational copy of somewhere else. Several neighbouring societies have spent the past 50 years building at extraordinary speed. And they have produced, alongside the genuine achievements, a particular kind of rootlessness that comes from constructing too fast on foundations that were never given time to set. The identity gets built over and the memory gets demolished. The new thing arrives before anyone had properly understood what it is replacing. Oman chose the slower path, the path that kept the foundation visible. That choice has a cost. Oman is not the first name that comes up in conversations about Gulf investment, global tourism, or regional influence. It does not have the profile of its neighbours and has never tried to acquire one. But what it has instead is something the loudest countries in the region are now quietly looking for in themselves and struggling to find. What it has instead is something that the loudest countries in the region are now quietly searching for and not finding. A reason to stay that has nothing to do with money. But the architectural choice and the cultural code are expressions of something even older and deeper than Kabu's vision. They reflect a philosophical and religious tradition that predates the Sultanate, oil, and the modern state by over 1,000 years. A way of understanding the relationship between people, God, and each other that is specific to Oman, and almost entirely unknown outside it. The Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque in Muscat, completed in 2001, contains a hand-woven carpet in its main prayer hall that took 600 women 4 years to complete. At the time of its installation, it was the largest hand-woven carpet in the world. The mosque is one of the few in the Arab world open to non-Muslim visitors. Entry is free. The only requirement is respectful dress. In a single building, that combination tells you most of what you need to know about how Oman understands the relationship between faith, beauty, and the outside world. The Ibadi mindset, the faith that shaped a nation's foreign policy. Most people who discuss the Islamic world divide it into two categories, Sunni and Shia. The two great branches of the faith separated by a dispute over succession that happened 14 centuries ago and has been shaping politics, wars, and alliances ever since. Almost every conversation about religion and conflict in the Middle East operates within that framework. Sunni Gulf states on one side, Shia Iran on the other hand, the tension between them running underneath almost every regional crisis of the past 40 years. Oman fits neither category, and that single fact explains more about this country than almost anything else you will read or hear about it. The dominant religious tradition in Oman is Ibadism. It is not a sect in the way that Sunni and Shia Islam are sects. It is older than that division and predates the split entirely. It developed its own theology, understanding of governance, and relationship between faith and daily life, entirely independently of the conflict that divided the rest of the Islamic world. What it produced over 14 centuries of practice in the mountains and valleys and coastal towns of Oman is a way of being religious that looks and feels fundamentally different from almost anywhere else in the Arab world. To understand why Oman behaves the way it does internationally, why it talks to everyone, offends no one, and has become the most trusted back channel in one of the most volatile regions on earth, you have to start here. In the theology, because the diplomacy did not come from political calculation alone. It came from something much older and much harder to manufacture. Ibadism is built on two principles above all others. The first is modesty, not just in dress or personal behavior, but in the exercise of power, in the expression of opinion, and in the relationship between a believer and everyone they encounter. The loudest voice in the room is not the wisest. The person who ends the argument is more valuable than the person who wins it. These are not abstract ideals in Omani culture. They are behavioral norms that shape how people speak to each other, of how business is conducted and how politics is practiced at every level from the village to the palace. The second principle is non-confrontation. Ibadism does not encourage proselytizing. It does not teach that its followers have a duty to bring others to their understanding of the faith. Nor does it position itself in opposition to other Islamic traditions. In the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque, Sunnis, Shias, and Ibadis pray together on the same carpet without ceremony or division. That is not a modern liberal gesture added to make the country appear tolerant. It is a 1,400-year-old instruction that has never been questioned here. Ibadism is the foundation of our entire character, the elder says, his hands wrapped around his small coffee cup, his voice carrying the particular patience of someone explaining something he has never needed to explain before because it has always simply been true. We are taught that loud arguments are a sign of weakness, that listening is always more powerful than shouting. We do not judge how other nations run their affairs, and we expect the same respect in return. This is not a foreign policy strategy. It is just how we were raised. The practical expressions of the Ibadi mindset are visible in daily Omani life once you know what to look for. The mosques are simpler than in neighbouring countries. Minarets are shorter. Ornamentation is restrained. The architecture of worship reflects the same values as the architecture of the city. They chose substance over display, depth over drama. Religious life in Oman does not announce itself on the street the way it does in Saudi Arabia or Iran. It is present everywhere and visible nowhere in particular. It has become the quiet texture of how people live rather than a performance they put on for each other. The tolerance principle has produced specific and observable results over centuries. Christian churches operate in Muscat. Hindu temples serve Oman's significant Indian community, which has been present on the Omani coast for hundreds of years through the old trading routes. The state does not interfere with the private religious practice of non-Muslims. This is not a recent concession made under international pressure. It is a reflection of a tradition that never understood coercion as a legitimate tool of faith. In our tradition, you cannot force a person toward God, the elder says quietly. You can show them the path. You can invite them. But to force them is to insult both them and God simultaneously. We have always believed this. It is why foreigners have always been welcome here, even in the old times when the country was otherwise closed. The door was locked against the political world. It was never locked against the human one. Now take those same principles out of the mosque and into the world. What they produce on the international stage is something nobody designed and nobody else has managed to replicate. A country that genuinely has no enemies. Not a country that manages its enemies carefully through deterrence and strategic alliances, or a country that has neutralized its threats through military strength, but a country that has simply, through consistent behavior across 5 decades, made itself impossible to hate. Iran does not consider Oman a threat. Saudi Arabia does not consider Oman a rival. Israel has had more contact with Oman than with almost any other Arab state. The United States trusts Oman completely. The Houthi movement in Yemen talks to Oman when it will not talk to anyone else. That last fact is not an accident or a lucky outcome of geography. It is the product of a country that has never given anyone a reason to distrust it and has spent 50 years making sure that record stays clean. Oman does not take sides. Not as a diplomatic strategy adopted in a foreign ministry meeting, as a cultural reflex developed over 14 centuries of living in a geography that required trading with everyone and surviving the ambitions of larger empires from every direction. The Ibadi instruction not to impose your views on others extended naturally into Omani political practice as not imposing your allegiances on others either. If you will not tell your neighbour which branch of Islam to follow, you will also not tell your neighbour which superpower to align with. The logic is the same. The principle is the same. Only the scale changes. This produced a foreign policy posture so consistent and so rare that the world's major powers eventually began to rely on it. Not because Oman asked them to, because they had no alternative. When the United States needed to communicate with Iran without acknowledging that communication was happening, there was only one country in the world that both sides trusted completely. A country that had no ideological stake in the outcome and had a demonstrated track record of keeping a secret for as long as a secret needed to be kept. The theology that taught Omanis to listen more than they speak and to end arguments rather than win them. They were taught to treat the stranger at the door as a responsibility rather than a threat. The theology had produced, entirely as a byproduct of 14 centuries of quiet practice, the most effective diplomatic backchannel in the modern Middle East. The faith built the character built the reputation, and the reputation built the room where history got made. Ibadi Muslims make up approximately 45% of Oman's total population and represent the overwhelming majority of Omani citizens. Outside Oman, Ibadi communities exist in small numbers in Algeria, Libya and Tanzania, but together they represent less than 1% of the world's Muslim population. Ibadism is one of the oldest surviving Islamic traditions and one of the least studied outside academic circles. Most Western analyses of the Middle East do not mention it at all. Most analyses of Omani foreign policy do not mention it either. Both omissions are significant mistakes. Quick pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Oman's remarkable story, hit that like button and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel, and it truly helps us keep making documentaries like this. The Secret Diplomat: How Oman Became the World's Most Important Back Channel. Think about what it means for two countries to have no diplomatic relationship. Not a difficult relationship or a strained one. There was no relationship at all. No embassy, hotline and back channel. They had no agreed protocol for what happens if a ship is seized, or a soldier is captured, or a missile lands somewhere it was not supposed to land. Just silence. And underneath the silence, they had decades of completely deniable and known to almost nobody. They produced nothing immediately visible, but they established something more important than any signed agreement. They established that the two sides could sit in the same room without the entire thing collapsing. The serious negotiations began in 2013. Senior Americans provided the space and the logistical support. It also provided something harder to quantify. When the Qatar blockade of 2017 threatened to permanently fracture the Gulf Cooperation Council, Oman kept its embassy in Doha open and its trade routes with Qatar running, maintaining a thread of connection that prevented complete rupture while everyone else was cutting ties. The pattern across all of these situations is identical. Oman offers a channel. The channel is used. The details are never disclosed. The result is presented to the world as a development between the parties directly involved. Oman's name does not appear in the headline. That is not an oversight or a failure of recognition. That is the service. The back channel only works in the dark. The trusted mediator only works if it cannot be compromised by publicity or political pressure. The country that everyone comes to when every other conversation has failed only works because it has never, in 50 years of carrying messages between enemies, betrayed a confidence or used its position for personal advantage. That record cannot be bought or borrowed. It can only be built, one kept secret at a time, across decades of consistent behaviour that most of the world never sees and never hears about. Oman has spent 50 years building it. And the world, whether it acknowledges it publicly or not, has been relying on it ever since. During the Yemen conflict between 2015 and 2023, Oman facilitated the release of over 200 hostages and prisoners of war through its back channel with the Houthi movement. The releases included American citizens, British nationals, and Saudi prisoners of war. Each one was presented publicly as a bilateral humanitarian gesture between the relevant parties. Each one was the product of months of quiet Omani diplomacy, conducted through channels that none of the parties officially acknowledged. The total number of people whose lives were directly affected by Omani mediation during this period is significantly higher than the documented cases alone suggest. The landscape that made Oman. Stand at the top of Jebel Shams at dawn and look down. The canyon drops over 1,000 meters straight below you. The air is cold, the rock is ancient and sharp and completely indifferent to your presence. You're in Arabia, but nothing around you looks like the Arabia most people imagine. No sand and flat horizon, just mountains folding into more mountains as far as you can see. This is where the Omani character was actually formed. Not in a palace, in an oil field. Here, in terrain that spent thousands of years teaching the people inside it one lesson above all others: patience. The Hajar Mountains run along the northern coast like a wall. They are not gentle. The paths through them are narrow, the drops are sudden, and the rock does not forgive careless movement. For most of history, these mountains kept the coast separate from the interior, and both of them separate from the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. Communities on different sides of the same ridge developed their own dialects, their own customs, their own ways of doing everything. The land did not just shape people, it created whole worlds inside a small country. The mountains protected us from the chaos outside, the elder says, his eyes drifting toward the peaks visible above the city. When wars tore through the rest of the region, our people were safe behind that stone. The land shaped our character before any government did. It taught us that you cannot rush a mountain. You work with what is there, or you do not survive. Every part of Oman's geography taught the same lesson in a different way, and each part produced something remarkable that exists nowhere else. The Musandam Peninsula sits separated from the rest of Oman by a strip of UAE territory, pushing into the Strait of Hormuz like a fist of rock. Its coastline is a series of narrow inlets where limestone cliffs fall straight into deep turquoise water. It looks exactly like the fjords of Norway. It sits in the tropics. Villages here were reachable only by boat for centuries, which preserved a language called Kumzari that exists nowhere else on Earth, mixing Arabic, Persian, Hindi, Portuguese and English into something entirely its own. Travel 1,000 kilometers south and Dofa receives a monsoon every summer that turns the mountains green while the rest of Arabia bakes. Frankincense trees grow here because of this microclimate, and those trees fed a trade network that connected Oman to Rome, Egypt and China for 2,000 years. Under the desert sands nearby lay the lost city of Ubar, dismissed as legend by Western historians, found by NASA satellite imaging in 1992, exactly where the Bedouin always said it would be. Every part of this landscape slowed things down and created space. They built patience into the people living inside it until patience stopped being a strategy and became a personality. That personality built the diplomacy. And now both the landscape and the diplomacy face a challenge neither was designed for. The ancient Falaj irrigation channels of Oman have been carrying water from underground mountain springs to farming villages for over 3,000 years, using nothing but gravity. More than 4,000 of them are still working today. UNESCO declared them a World Heritage Site in 2006. The Post-Oil Clock Vision 2040. Oman's oil will run out soon, not tomorrow or next, not even next year. But within the lifetime of children sitting in school right now, the revenue stream that built everything will be gone. Saudi Arabia sits on roughly 260 billion barrels of oil reserves. The UAE holds around 100 billion. Oman has approximately 5 billion. The easy oil is already gone. What remains is harder and more expensive to pull from the ground. The window is narrowing faster than most outsiders realise, and every Omani policymaker knows it. The government's answer is called Vision 2040. Build a new economy before the old one runs dry. Tourism, green energy, logistics, technology, private sector jobs for a young population that can no longer rely on the government to employ them. It sounds straightforward on paper. On the ground, it is considerably more complicated. Tourism is the most visible part of the plan. Oman is genuinely well positioned for it. The landscape is extraordinary. The culture is authentic. The country is safe. The kind of traveller who is tired of mass-market Gulf destinations and looking for something that feels real was made for Oman. International arrivals are growing fast. New hotels are opening. Airlines are adding routes. But growth brings its own problems, and Oman is starting to feel them in ways that are difficult to ignore. We are standing on a very thin wire right now, the elder says, his voice carrying something heavier than his usual patience. For my whole life, our isolation was our protection. We kept the world at a distance so we could stay who we are. Now we are inviting the world inside. We need their money and we need jobs for our young people. But how do you open the door to millions of tourists without letting them change everything that made you worth visiting? The tension he is describing is already visible on the ground. The wadis that used to require hours of hiking to reach are getting paved parking lots at the entrance. Quiet fishing villages that have existed for centuries are attracting interest from international hotel chains. The frankincense trees of Dhofar appear on travel influencer pages hundreds of times a day. Salalah during the Kharif is crowded now in ways it never used to be. The youth question sits alongside all of this. Oman has a young population with a median age of around 26. The historical path of joining the public sector and receiving a stable government salary is closing. Young Omanis are being pushed into a private sector economy that is still finding its shape. They are adapting faster than anyone expected, and the results are already visible. The young woman coding in a co-working space while her grandmother's coffee pot sits on the desk beside her is not a contradiction. She is the answer. Educated, connected and proud of where she comes from, and trying to hold both worlds at once. Oman has always modernised on its own terms. The question Vision 2040 is really asking is whether that principle can survive contact with the global economy at the scale now arriving. The clock is running, the concrete is being poured at the edge of the wadis, and somewhere in the mountains the frankincense trees are still growing at exactly the pace they have always grown, completely indifferent to all of it. Oman is currently building one of the world's largest green hydrogen production facilities in its southern desert. It is designed to make the country a major exporter of clean energy to Europe and Asia. A country that built everything on oil is betting its future on wind and sun. Whether that bet pays off will define the next 50 years of Omani history. The last authentic corner. 1 minute the light is gold and warm across the white buildings of Muscat. Then it is gone and the city settles into evening, the call to prayer moving through the streets like something that has always been there and always will be. The pace does not change, the noise does not rise. Muscat at night feels the same as Muscat at noon, unhurried, completely itself. That quality is rarer than it sounds. Most cities in this region have been remade so thoroughly in the last 50 years that they carry almost no memory of what they were before. Oman carries its memory in every arch, restored fort, and every wadi that still requires a proper walk to reach. The past is not preserved behind glass here. It is still in daily use. Oman's story is not about refusing to change. It is about choosing how to change and what to protect while doing it. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Plenty of countries have developed fast. Very few have developed fast and kept their soul intact at the same time. Oman is one of them. And the reason comes back to the same thing every time. A set of values rooted in faith and landscape, and a long history of trading with the world without being consumed by it, pointing in the same direction across 5 decades regardless of who was in power or what the economic pressure was demanding. The diplomacy and architecture grew from those values. The hospitality grew from those values. None of it was invented by a ministry or a marketing agency. It grew here slowly over a very long time, in a landscape that had no patience for anything built too quickly on a foundation that had not been tested. "We cannot freeze the world in place," the elder says, standing slowly and adjusting his robe. "My grandchildren will live in a very different Oman than the one I grew up in. They will have more connections, more opportunities, more of everything the modern world offers. That is progress and you cannot fight it. My only hope is that they remember the code of the desert. A house is only as strong as its foundation, not its height." He looks out at the street for a moment, then back at you. The expression on his face is not nostalgia. It is something closer to trust, a quiet confidence that what was built here is solid enough to survive what is coming. Oman stays a secret because secrecy is the service it provides. The back channel only works in the dark. The trusted mediator only works if it cannot be compromised by recognition or publicity. The country that everyone comes to when no other conversation is possible only works because it has never traded its reputation for attention. The secret is not a side effect of the diplomacy. The secret is the diplomacy. Oman understood this from the beginning and has protected it ever since with the same quiet discipline it applies to everything else. The window to see this before it changes is narrowing. The parking lots are going in at the edge of the wadis. The hotel chains are arriving. The influencers have found the frankincense trees. Go now before the parking lots reach the last quiet wadi. Go before the secret is completely gone. If you enjoyed this journey through Oman, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.